I nailed it right at the right time.
I heard you.
To show that we're going live. Okay. It's all you, Patrick. Whenever you are ready.
Okay.
There's no title, by the way. Bink.
This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Patrick Gulo.
I'm Nate Blyton.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And I'm David McDonald. And this week, we've got another quick show of news headlines for you, and we're going to start with something that we've talked about before on the show. Tim Monroe, the flute player of 8th Blackbird, we mentioned a while ago, is going to be leaving the group. They have announced that Natalie Joachim, not sure if we're saying that name correctly, but apologize if we are, is going to be entering to take his place as the flute player in the ensemble. That's been in the works for a while, but it officially happened just this week, and there's a really nice kind of remembrance of Tim Monroe's time in 8th Blackbird on the 8th Blackbird blog, and we will have a link to that. There will be many fewer T-shirts, I believe, in the 8th Blackbird performance wardrobe, and judging by the recent round of photographs that they posted, they all look like awesome, cool professionals now, and Tim Rosenberg has one less thing to complain about. If you've not listened to Tim Rosenberg on the show before, he's been on both this show and other shows on the SoundNotion Network complaining about what 8th Blackbird wears, notably what Tim wears, Tim Monroe, that is, wears to perform, and so now we don't have that. That's one fewer thing that Tim Rosenberg has to complain about. I'm sure he will replace it with something, though.
And he's still not running short of things to complain about.
Right. Whining finds a way.
Well, it's too bad to see him leave the group, but exciting for him. I think we've all seen 8th Blackbird before, and Tim is like such a presence on the stage.
Yeah, he's a very big personality.
Yeah,
they all are. I think that's one of the things they do really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to being badass players.
Yes. And he was very tall, too, because in the sort of farewell, it talks about forcing him to get stuff from high shelves.
That's important that we note that.
It is.
Flutist and stock boy.
Right. So, moving on, there are some thoughts on the operas. I know both Sam and Patrick have a lot of thoughts on opera.
Opera.
Thoughts on opera.
A thought opera.
Yes.
This sounds like a public access TV show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thoughts on opera.
So tell us about opera, Patrick.
Tell us about opera.
Yeah,
yes. What is the opera?
What is Tai Chi?
What's opera, Doc? Yeah, right.
Well, I think what you're referring to, Dave, is a recent article written by David Patrick Stearns in the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Indeed.
Commenting on the state of current opera and the way critics talk about opera and audiences in general talk about opera. And when there is something that everyone seems to be on board with and think is fantastic, while at the same time there being some dissenting voices. He specifically spoke about George Benjamin's opera Written on Skin, which was recently part of the Mostly Mozart Festival, which I saw, and I very, very, very much liked. I thought it was some of the most colorful music. And
specifically Written on Skin, or the Mostly Mozart Festival generally?
Written on Skin.
Okay.
Written on Skin. And I thought the story was a clever story, really interesting to watch, and just put together nicely. And most critics pretty much said the same thing. As it far better than I'm saying it right now. They said it was like kind of the best thing since sliced bread. At least in the past couple decades, perhaps like one of the greatest operas. And it didn't strike David Patrick Stearns as much. So he's kind of like went into a commentary on how the role of the critic a bit, and how do we talk about works of art being great or not great if the most vocal voices, for lack of a better term, can't agree on something.
Well, I kind of think that's always been the case, right? We've always seen you can go back and there are writers who are fond of going back into the archives and finding some critic slamming Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra or
Sure.
slamming Mahler 3 or something that everybody now widely regards as, one of these great masterworks. So I don't think that is terribly unusual, but I do think it's worth thinking about how we talk about opera in a lot of different ways. Another thing that you pointed out, we were talking before the show, is that a lot of these highly regarded operas are, at least in the United States, I don't necessarily think this is the case everywhere, but in the U.S., major opera premieres are all very accessible, very kind of neo-tonal, post-tonal something that kind of ignores a lot of the last 50 years of musical development or longer, really. In a way that instrumental music does not do that. Though there's certainly that style of instrumental music, but I feel like there's a lot more diversity at the high end of instrumental music that there is not in vocal music. You guys agree, Sam?
Well, yeah. I mean, in the article, he says that the neotonal generation, and using Higdon as an example, and Jack Heggie, is that how you pronounce it? Jack
No
Heggie.
idea.
Jake Higgins.
And Kevin Putz, obviously, with the Pulitzer Prize-winning Silent Night. These are the popular operas, and because they have a certain sort of tonal accessibility. I mean, it's you don't want to parse it down to just that one thing, but that's really what it is. It seems.
The exception was, though, that the critics did not really like Cold Mountain all that much, and he was one of the ones who did. So he was kind of like on this opposite, like the opposite ends of the spectrum for each opera, and David has been writing for years and years and years about he's so informed, especially about opera. So you're on
a first name basis with all these people, Patrick. David.
Yeah, David. In my emails.
By the way, we're not talking about me, David.
Stearns.
Yeah.
I think the more salient point is that those are the ones that are popular with people that buy tickets and keep operas in business.
I will say that I don't think it's not been that long since Zhao Long's Madame Whitesnake opera won a Pulitzer, and I don't think that was as accessible as, especially not as something like Kevin Putz or Jennifer Higdon.
Right.
But I think there's a lot to be said, not just about the cost of producing an opera informing that, but also the working with singers.
Yeah.
I think those are two different things that both play into that. When we talk about producing a new string quartet, that's a pretty low cost, and so the risk is much lower, and the organizations are much more closely tied to the musicians, and therefore I feel are more interested in taking those artistic risks than a big opera company mounting an opera production could, easily be into the tens of millions of dollars. And so I feel like the opera companies are less interested in taking those kinds of risks, and I think that really does noticeable harm to the progress of opera as a medium at that large scale. Having said that, there's a lot of smaller scale operas that I think can really serve that adventurous role, and there are certainly composers who are writing for smaller opera companies. We spoke many months ago on the show with Ken Ueno, who was working on a smaller opera I don't remember what the company was, somewhere in Boston maybe. Was
Is this
working
the one
on
with
this.
Cheerios?
Yeah, had like all kinds of really just strange production qualities, and of course Ken's music is I wouldn't call it inaccessible, but it's challenging and in a lot of really delightful ways. And but that's not getting the attention that Jennifer Higdon and Kevin Putz are getting. And frankly, I still don't understand Kevin Putz. Can someone please explain Kevin Putz to me?
Yeah.
Like, why is this a thing?
Yeah, but if we're talking about like people who are trying to get operas performed by mainstream opera companies, one of the example he uses in the piece is Charles Warren. Charles Warren is not going to go over as well with the Muggles as Jennifer Higdon is, no matter what the critics say.
Mm.
So that's
why they do it that way.
Yeah.
I did want to revisit that point you made, Dave, about programming for the large opera companies. You're right about the risk factor and everything, but a large part of programming, especially for popular opera companies, are the stars that they get and their decisions as to what they want to sing.
Exactly.
Like the Met knew they wanted Renee Fleming, and Renee was like, yeah, we're gonna do Dvorak's Wysolka, and like that's like not something that you program. Like that's but they did it because Renee Fleming wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like it comes down to like
Renee Fleming sells more tickets than Verdi does in those kinds of companies.
Exactly.
I think.
And that's why they have to play the game with the stars that they get.
Yep.
And I was just talking to someone about this recently, that singers have this notion. If you've ever spoken with a singer about new music and they talk about the composers they like, the phrase that I hear all the time is that, and maybe this says more about the singers that I hang out with than singers as a whole, but the phrase that I hear a lot is, so-and-so writes well for the voice. He or she really understands the voice. And what that means is he or she writes pretty music that I like.
It's code.
And it also, I think, and to be fair, I will say that a big part of it is that music is easier to prepare because it is a little bit more understandable regarding like expectations. Like you have clearer expectations that are followed, and so you have to spend less time memorizing everything and all of that stuff. I totally understand that working on a new opera role is an enormous undertaking for a singer. And that's one of the reasons I think that it is so hard to have a large-scale production of a new opera, is because you have to get 15, 30, 70 people to learn this 3-hour score, and it has to be memorized, and all of the rehearsals that go into, like, that's an enormous amount of work that you have to do to learn Jen Higdon's music even, or Kevin Putz's music even, compared to the Borodin opera that you perform every 3 years. And this is why a singer will learn Otello and then perform Otello with 8 different opera companies over 3 years, because that's such a huge undertaking. And that's never going to happen when it comes to Madame Whitesnake.
I think there is an art to vocal writing, though. Like there are clearly ways of writing that feel good for the voice, just like there are ways like feel good for the piano. Like
but I don't think that's what people mean when they say those things.
Yeah, and in addition, like writing non-idiomatic music for piano, as an example, sometimes is the best way to come up with some original-sounding piano music. And it being easily singable is not in and of itself a good or bad thing. It's just a thing that singers like.
Yeah.
And Dave, I have a great analogy about this, and it doesn't involve skateboarding.
Okay.
It's like superhero movies. So the fanboys.
In what way?
The fanboys for superhero movies want the stories to work out the way they want them to work out, and they want the heroes to be the way they want them to be. True comic book, realistic. With the same internal conflict and the same dissonances and everything. But the companies that produce these huge, big-budget movies want to put money in the bank, and they've come up with a formula that they know works. So it's hard for them to convince. It's hard for directors, as an example, to convince the money guys higher up to let them be more free and take more chances, because they have proved that this formula for a superhero works, and they're going to make $250 million. While the stakes aren't quite as high for an opera company, if they do a Verdi opera, people are going to show up.
I
They do.
think the stakes are proportionally higher. I think the opera company is riding much closer to the edge.
Thinner margins, yes. Not as much money, but way thinner margins. Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that is a good analogy. Patrick, thoughts? You still disagree that when people say so and so writes well for The Voice, they really mean that?
It depends who's saying it. If it's a
I suppose that's true. That's
Yeah.
absolutely true. When Renee Fleming says it, I believe it.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway.
in other orchestra, I guess, related news, last week we talked about the China taking an orchestra to Iran for a cultural exchange. It looks like Daniel Barenboim, who wanted to do the same thing, and actually he was the co-founder of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, that was an orchestra made up of young musicians from Israeli and Arab country, or from Israel and from Arab countries. And it's important to note that Daniel Barenboim is Israeli and Jewish. So this is a cultural exchange where I would say that the stakes are higher than China going to Iran. He was planning on doing it, I think it's next month, but it's not going to happen. At least right now, it doesn't look like it's going to happen because of protests, most notably from the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and from not the German.
What do the Germans know about classical music anyway?
The German Foreign Minister has agreed to back it. The Israeli Foreign Minister has unsurprisingly said this can't happen because it would increase the chances that the current U.S. nuclear deal with Iran would be approved, which I don't see how that's possibly the case. But it's disappointing when global politics are taken to the point where something as I don't know what the right word is. Harmless is not the right word because it's not even that in that context. But something as possibly enriching as a cultural exchange of this type is basically shot down by people who have political interests that don't really have anything to do with the case at hand.
I think harmless is an interesting word to use there because the thing that makes this so frustrating is that it is so low risk and so potentially high reward.
Yes.
Like there's a lot that could start from this kind of collaboration, and to not have, and there's very little risk. Like there's what's going to happen? You've got a bunch of 20-year-olds with violins. You
know what it is. It's like
Are you saying it's the?
It's legitimizing what people think is a bad regime, the bad government. It's the reason why people are against the nuclear treaty in the first place. Like you're playing their game and you're acting like they're big kids at a big kids table.
This is how you get people to act like big kids, though, is to treat them like big kids.
I completely agree.
Let's start by not treating them like big kids at first. Let's start by pretending that humans actually live in that country, which is the current political climate wants to deny even that. If we portray Iran as anything but a nation of barbarians who want to kill everybody who stands in their way, then we hate America or we want to destroy Israel or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's a shame that is working out the way it has. Hopefully, things will change.
It's like the prison versus treatment argument. Like, you can help them along, or you can just throw them in prison.
Yeah.
Forget about their problem.
Yeah. Well, Dave hates when we get too political, but
No, I'm okay with getting political when political is called for. Also, I'm giving up that's a silly rule. We're going to talk about stuff that we care about talking about.
Well, I mean, we impose these sanctions and things to get them to negotiate with us. I mean, that's what's happening now. So I don't understand. I mean, I don't understand what the alternative would be. Well, actually, I do, and that's the sad part.
We are solving problems here on SoundNotion. You see this? We are solving serious geopolitical issues. One thing that we just read a story recently on New Music Box this week about music for Freddie Gray, who died in police custody in Baltimore. And there's an interesting thing that I think is a contrast between what we're talking about in the music for Freddie Gray, songs for Freddie Gray movement, and the East-West Divan Orchestra thing, is that music is devoid of a lot of its. I mean, there's nothing in that music that the orchestra is playing that is about the conflict, and it is abstract. And
this is the problem I have with like memorial concerts and everything like that.
What is the problem?
Like, let's play pretty music, and that.
We're gonna play the Adagietto from Mahler 5.
Yeah.
Oh man, like, I don't even want to talk about this.
What? Wow. Patrick just got up and left on us.
I like how you just hid.
No, it's like such a. I mean, like it's a gesture, but the gesture is empty when it's just like here's some beautiful music, and let's all get together and listen to it, and like I don't think that hits home as much as, actual like bringing in the community, like this author had said, bringing in the community to actually speak on it.
Well, so there's a piece on New Music Box this week by Ruby Fulton called Sonic Uprising, Songs for Freddie Gray, and she's talking about some of the music written for these very highly charged protests around race relations, especially with regard to police and police enforcement in big cities. And I don't know what, like, you couldn't use the Mahler example. You couldn't use Mahler or Dvorak or Barber to say anything about this stuff. And the music that she cites in this piece is all music that has words. And the words are very powerful. And she talks about hip-hop artists and, staying in because there was a strictly enforced curfew, and artists going home and making tracks in their home studios because they couldn't go out. And I don't think there's anything like that in classical music. And the examples of it in classical music all have to do with collaborations with popular musicians, and specifically popular musicians that are creating words for the things that they're making. I don't know. What do you guys think about this?
I think we hide behind the idea that music is a universal language.
Okay.
Well, I think it just goes back to no matter what people want to believe, music without text can't tell a story. It can help amplify a story if it's programmatic and you tell people, read this thing, and this is how I want you to understand the music.
Yeah.
But when that is done in the context of not even taking original works and just sort of trying to turn Adagio for strings or whatever into the program that you're trying to get across by telling people, now hear it this way in this context involving these social injustices, and doing it that way is a pretty hollow gesture in my opinion.
Do you think that that's something we should be spending more time on as American composers writing in 2015? Is this something that we have a responsibility? Because obviously, you made a joke earlier about me having a stupid dogmatic rule about not wanting to talk too much about politics on the show, but it's hard not to have a strong reaction in any direction to something like Freddie Gray or Michael Brown. And do you think that we are, kind of abdicating responsibility as artists in America in 2015 to not write music that relates to these things? And if so, how do we do that? If we can't do it without words, how do we reflect on these things in our artistic expression?
That's a great question. I think one of the most obvious ways, if you're not going to use text of any kind, one of the most obvious ways is to pair your creative output with some sort of outreach that actually touches people that are either virtually or actually literally physically close to you and are involved in some sort of political or social justice issue that you care about.
I'm now making a note to talk about this in my studio class in the coming weeks.
I think that's a great point to bring up, Dave. I comment on these sorts of things without text, at least without a title or a program note. like you can't just say like, oh, obviously this piece is about
But even if you do give it even if you do give it a programmatic title, what are you saying just by saying this is a thing about Freddie Gray and then having a 15-minute string quartet?
I mean,
like that doesn't say anything about the situation. It just makes you be sad for 15 minutes.
To me, that's like an
or angry.
That is an extension of the terrible history we have with blacks in this country to begin with. We appropriated their physical bodies, we appropriate their labor, we appropriate their culture, and now we're appropriating their grief in order to make people listen to our string quartet. That's the worst thing you could do, I think. Whereas,
do you think
middle-class white dudes talking about race?
That's right.
Notion.
So do you think that white composers are using this issue as a launching pad for writing music?
This particular issue, I don't know, but I know that it does happen with.
I'm not saying it doesn't, but that's I haven't thought about that before. But maybe you're right.
So you're saying that we should not be writing about this issue?
I think we should find a more meaningful way to write about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like a piece that, and I don't know if it's possible to do for a white composer, as an example, without some sort of collaboration involved. I don't know.
It depends on what your mission is. Like if you genuinely want to comment on these things and you feel strongly about it, then by all means go ahead. But it's kind of like people who talk about reform in the Middle East not coming from a white guy down the street. It needs to come from within.
Speaking of race things, one thing that is also problematic is that the style of music that we're talking about is a very racially homogenous community that makes this music that we make, right? It's mostly white dudes that we talk about writing this stuff, and we have a lot of initiatives. Some of them are wonderful that are trying to create a more diverse classical music community and fine arts community more generally. But at the moment, it's still very white, and perhaps making music about a racial issue like this is not appropriate for us. And that seems to be defeatist when I put it like that, though. I don't like the way I said that just now. That makes me think that was a dumb idea.
I understand where that comes from, but I mean, I think at the end of the day, though, like people should be able to make art any way they want to, as long as it's not, physically hurting people or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the specific content within the pieces, that does get complicated about your relationship with the community that you're trying to, trying to help or work with or anything like that. And I agree with I haven't chimed in about something like this in a while, but the whole thing of a string quartet for somebody else's loss, people give flowers for something like that, and a piece of music might be able to be appreciated just on that level. It's nice. It seems went to some trouble, but maybe not more than that. However, putting together a concert or something like that and using it as a fundraiser and having that money go towards some cause that people in that community are doing and are really pushing forward, then that might be a less complicated way to help. That might actually be helpful.
Well, if for classical music, I think it has to reach beyond the page, and that includes the program notes, to really do something. If you're really going to try and do something, then it has to be more than just saying, and this is written for the people who died, here it is. Mm-hmm. But not that, well, and I was just thinking, not that you couldn't write a piece that addresses the issue in some meaningful way, but you can't just say this is to memorialize Freddie Gray or whatever. As an example, write a piece that is, even if it doesn't have text, that's some way a reflection on your own inner life of dealing with the idea of white privilege, as an example. I'll be honest and say, growing up poor in the South, coming to terms with the idea of white privilege is a little bit different maybe than it might be for people from other parts of the country. Yeah. And I think that would be a totally worthwhile thing to address and more meaningful than trying to understand another marginalized group's grief is, look inside yourself and see what inside you there is to say about it. And I think that would be more meaningful than trying to look outward, and unless you're going to actually collaborate with someone, which I'm also a big fan of.
Sure.
Yeah, and I just thought of this, but two of the early Steve Reich tape loop pieces that we all are subjected to in class. They're delightful pieces. I'd say that about a lot of music history music, but this is music history music is the kind of thing that is in the Grout textbook.
Yeah.
And the two Grout textbook tape loop pieces are Come Out and It's Gonna Rain, and Steve Reich is a white dude, and those recordings are both black dudes. And the source recording for "It's Gonna Rain" is a black minister, and you can hear it really clearly at the beginning before it gets segmented. He's saying for 40 days and 40 nights, it's gonna rain after a while, and it's kind of that really beautiful speech sing thing that black ministers are known for. And then the other recording is much more politically charged, and it is a guy who was arrested during the Harlem riot in 1964, who is talking about his treatment at the hands of the police, actually. And he was beaten and he had bruises, and to get medical treatment, he had to demonstrate that he was bleeding, and so he wasn't bleeding outside his skin, and so they weren't letting him get medical treatment. And so he says, and this is what he's talking, this is kind of gross, so apologies in advance, trigger warning for the squeamish. He says he had to open the bruise up and let some of the bruise blood come out to show them, and that's what he's talking about. He's talking about literally making himself bleed so that he can get medical attention. And when you listen to the loop "Come Out to Show Them," that is, I think, really impactful if you know what it's coming from. And even though musically the thing that's happening in the music doesn't have anything to do really with the context, but I think being confronted with that over and over again, to me, is pretty impactful, even though that's not what the music is about, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? So
it's not surprising that early minimalists figured out a way to make their music that made some sort of meaningful connection, considering I think the one thing you could say about all those guys is they looked what was going on in their field, classical music, and just said, nah, I'm not down with that, and wanted to do something else. So, not surprising to me.
This is the thing that we should continue to have conversations about, because I think that we talk all the time about how relevant or irrelevant classical music is to contemporary culture, and perhaps one of the ways that we can become more relevant is to make music that speaks to our times, and it's something that at least I am spectacularly bad at. I make music that is almost entirely and usually completely abstract, that doesn't have anything to do with anything outside of itself, and I think that's maybe an issue that each of us has to figure out. I still like making abstract music, but maybe that's not the only thing I should be making.
Well, modern culture, one of the big things about it that people discuss all the time is the different ways we can connect, and collaborate is a new thing in human culture, the ease and speed, and I don't see any reason why that ease and speed shouldn't be at sometimes incorporated into new music. It could be one of the things that makes it new.
Well, and another thing is incorporating other styles of music. We talked about how the music that we make is tied to a particular kind of culture, but the music of the culture that is particularly impacted by this issue of police violence is also a very distinct musical culture. And it's very difficult to bridge that gap without the idea of kind of co-opting another group's cultural products, which is another really difficult thing to talk about. We're stepping on all kinds of landmines between race issues and Israel, and
we have things to say.
We have a lot of things to say. You can send us your hate mail. You can find us on Twitter. We're at SoundNotion. Before we wrap up, actually, we should say we just read this news in the last few hours, so it's very, very sad. There's a lot that is still, I think, probably unknown about this, but New York actor Kyle Jean-Baptiste, who is the understudy and is the first black guy to play Jean Valjean in Les Mis, died just, I guess, last night, this morning, from a fall, and he was only 21 years old. So we wish him and his family and the community in New York around him the best, and it's very sad. We'll hopefully find out some more about that as time goes on. But if you have any thoughts on any of the things that we've talked about this week, I know there are a lot of things that a lot of people probably do have thoughts on. You can find us on Twitter at SoundNotion. You can find us individually. I'm Dave McDowd. That's DAVEMACDO. Sam is at Housegoy, HOUSEGOY. Patrick is now what? At P Gulo. Did you change it?
At Pat Gulo.
At Pat Gulo, PATGULLO, and Nate is at Anatetree, 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 and you can also find us on Facebook and on Tumblr and also on our site soundnotion.tv/SN, where you can also find links to all the stories that we spoke about.
And Ashley Madison.
And Ashley Madison. We are on Ashley Madison. It's a secret, though. Don't tell anybody. Because I'm very confident in their security, and that's why we're there.
Okay.
So thank you so much for being with us this week. And I know it was a weird, tough episode. Do you guys have any closing thoughts before we wrap this one?
I liked it.
I did too. We should talk about this tough stuff more, because we get real talk here on SoundNotion. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back next week.
Marriage of Figaro was way too long.